Should Alijah Vera-Tucker stay at tackle? What's up with the Jets' defensive line rotations? How do you build offensive line depth? We'll talk about all of this and more on today's mailbag edition of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Wednesday, October 5th, 2022, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com, thanking you for making this show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening. You'll never miss an episode. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps the channel out and it helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn helps you find the candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. Well, today we have our weekly mailbag show. Thanks to everybody who sent in questions. We begin with a question about Alijah Vera-Tucker. Hey, John. Without a long-term plan at left tackle, do we continue to start Alijah Vera-Tucker there if he strings together successful performances? I know the scouting report was that he could become a good tackle or an elite guard, but it's no question the blind side is more important than the guard position. Would love to hear your thoughts. Well, I think Alijah Vera-Tucker is going to get the next few starts at left tackle because Jets have so many injuries. Max Mitchell getting injured now means Connor McDermott does have to go to the starting lineup. So it's going to be a good test for Alijah Vera-Tucker. Now, I think most of the prognostications at the point he was drafted was that he probably is better suited inside at the guard position. But we're going to see. He'll get. I think the first game against Pittsburgh was very promising. I think you also have to consider that, he made that change on the fly. It's one thing to get a full training camp's worth of work, to get some preseason reps. He had to do that essentially with a few days of notice, which I think is particularly impressive. And, the Steelers, even without TJ Watt, they have some decent guys coming off the edge. I think there was once or twice he got beaten, but all in all, a really solid effort by Alijah Vera-Tucker. I think back to an interview I did with a draft analyst a few years ago, and I can't remember the player I was discussing with him, but it was a player who could play multiple positions. He was a guy who projected at a lot of different spots. I think it was a guy who was similar to Vera-Tucker, a guy who was viewed as somebody who could play guard, but maybe could also play tackle. And the draft analyst I interviewed said that his philosophy on this is when you're not sure which position a player will be ultimately end up, you stick him first at the highest value position. And then if he fails out of that, then you move him to the lower value position. And I think that's a good philosophy. Now, of course, last year when the Jets drafted Vera-Tucker, they had Mekhi Becton, who they thought was going to be a long-term player at left tackle. Unfortunately, not looking that way. They also had George Fant returning as an incumbent starter, and they had a pretty big hole at the guard position. So Vera-Tucker got his first look at guard. For the Jets at that point, it made more sense to play Vera-Tucker at guard. But if he succeeds at tackle, I think you have to look at leaving him there. Now, I'm not sure how well he's going to continue to play at tackle because, as you mentioned, the scouting reports always indicated he was going to be a better guard. And when we talk positional value, it's not just about, a left tackle is worth more than a guard. It's not just having a left tackle is more important than finding a guard. It's also the degree of difficulty at finding players who can effectively play these positions. And it's a lot easier to find somebody who can play guard effectively than it is finding somebody who can play tackle. A lot of that's just based on the fact that when you're playing guard, you have help on both sides. You have a center helping you out on the inside, and you have a tackle helping you out on the outside. When you're at the tackle position, you don't have help on one of your sides. Now, sometimes a team, you may have a tight end next to you, but you're not always going to have that. Frequently, you're essentially one-on-one, and you got to protect the edge. And there aren't a lot of players with the athleticism necessary to handle that position in the NFL. So if you're looking at which position's easier to fill, well, guard is easier to fill. So the Jets heading into this offseason, I mean, if you're looking at this objectively, at this point, it's very likely they're going to need to replace both of their tackle spots because George Fant's going to be a free agent, and it just feels like that relationship is deteriorating. It feels like another one of these situations where the team and the player just aren't happy with each other right now. And if things can always change. There's still a lot of football left to be played. There's still a lot of time between now and free agency. But I think based on what you've seen over the course of the offseason, based on Fant's play, based on Fant's unhappiness over his lack of a new contract, based on Fant's unhappiness about constantly being shuffled between the right side and the left side, it's feeling like George Fant's leaving. And then at the other spot, I mean, I don't know if you want to trust Wayne Brown, but Mekhi Becton, can you really count on Mekhi Becton? So essentially the Jets are going to need to replace both tackles. If you do have an internal solution in VeraTucker, that makes life a little bit easier because then you don't have to worry about one of the two spots. Then you need a tackle and a guard. And it's going to be easier to find a tackle and a guard than it is to find two tackles. Now, I think we're getting ahead of ourselves here because one good game for VeraTucker does not necessarily indicate he's a keeper at the tackle position. But I think it's one of those things that's worth monitoring. In addition to playing him there because until people get healthy, it's their best option. And again, like last week on the mailbag, I mentioned this on Monday, but I want to give a shout out to whoever asked that mailbag question last week because last week I did get a mailbag question when we did this show about whether the Jets should move VeraTucker to the left tackle position, and I said no. And the person who asked the question said yes, and that person was clearly right because Jets fared better with VeraTucker at left tackle than I think they would have otherwise. But we're going to get a look at this over the next few weeks. I think if it's working, you don't mess with it. But there's still a long way to go. It is only one game, and I think it's important to keep that in context, that sometimes, you get one game and then future opponents get a chance to look at the film. They get a chance to see where a player's vulnerable. And that's really the point where you find out whether a player can stick. Because it's one thing to play effectively for a week. It's another after opponents get an idea of what your tendencies are about where you may be weak and they figure out a plan to attack it. If you can hold up then you might have a chance. So, long way of saying, leave him there till he fails. And, the Jets don't really have a choice right now because they have so many injuries at the tackle position that I don't really know what the alternative would be to playing VeraTucker there. Our next question, and it's about Mekhi Becton. It's about the fifth-year option. John, what do you think the Jets should do with Mekhi Becton? A decision needs to be made about giving him a fifth-year option after the season. There's no way he should get that, right? So, if you're not familiar with the fifth-year option, then fifth-year option only applies to players who were drafted in the first round. Players who are drafted get 4-year contracts, but players who are drafted in the first round, the team has an option. It's a team option for a fifth year. And the way it's calculated is based on various pieces of criteria, such as how many snaps the player has played, whether he's made a Pro Bowl. There's a lot that goes into it, and the position that he plays. I won't go into the details there, but one of the catches is that the team needs to decide the deadline for picking up the fifth-year option is the offseason between year 3 and year 4. Now, there have been recently changes to the way the fifth-year option operates. In the past, it was not guaranteed. So you could cut a player, if you decided, we don't want to do this, you could always cut the player before the league year of the player's fifth year began. And then once the league year began for year 5, the money was guaranteed. But you had kind of a runway there where you had about a year where you could cut the player if you didn't feel like it was worth it, and you would walk away from that without having to pay the player anything. There was one catch, however. The money became fully guaranteed if the player was so injured that he could not play. So, under that criteria, there's no way you would ever pick up the fifth-year option for Becton, because the way that money would become guaranteed under the old system was that if the player had such a bad injury that he could not play. Well, a player like Becton who's missed 2 full seasons because of injuries, are you really going to roll the dice on that? Probably not. The new system makes it even less likely because now the way it works is the second you exercise the fifth-year option, that money is fully guaranteed. And they're paying, you essentially get paid like a starting tackle. You get paid pretty good money. So would you fully guarantee a fifth year for Mekhi Becton? Would you guarantee any more money for Mekhi Becton after he's essentially missed 2 full seasons? I don't think so. And I think we're to the point with Becton where, yeah, he comes back next year. I mean, he's going to be one of the 4 or 5, however many tackles you keep. He'll be one of the 4 most talented tackles on the team. So there's no reason to cut him. And next year he's not going to make that much money. And the money's guaranteed anyway. I mean, it's not like you save money by getting rid of Becton. But you cannot bring him back as a starter. I mean, how can you possibly count on him to play a full 17 games? I think what you do is you bring him back and you try and work him into a backup role. And then maybe if you have an injury and you need to get through 2 to 3 weeks, maybe Becton can give you that. But I think we're past the point where we can really hope Becton can hold up over the course of a long season. I think anything it gives you at this point is a bonus. And there's absolutely, I think there's no chance the Jets are picking up the 5th-year option because you're guaranteeing him money. You can't guarantee Mekhi Becton any more money than he's already made. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to talk about a topic which has frustrated many Jets fans. That's the defensive line rotation. How much should the Jets stick to it? How much should they play their best players more frequently? We'll discuss as we continue this Wednesday mailbag. If you're a small business, sometimes finding the right candidates can be difficult. And as you gear up this fall, you need the right people on your team to make your small business fire on all cylinders. That's what LinkedIn Jobs is here to do. They're here to make it easier to find the people you want to talk to faster and for free. Jets could probably use LinkedIn Jobs as they try and find new tackles. It feels like every week there's an injury at the tackle position. Fortunately, they have ways of finding tackles, but who knows? Maybe they'll use LinkedIn Jobs. Here's how it works. You create a free job post in minutes on LinkedIn Jobs to reach your network and beyond. You'll get to the world's largest professional network of over 810 million people. Then you can add your job and the purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you're hiring so your network can help you find the right people. There are simple tools like screening questions that make it easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire. I think for the Jets, it would be somebody who can play tackle well in the NFL and doesn't have a high rate of getting injured. And things like this are why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the candidates you want to talk to faster. Did you know every week nearly 40 million job seekers visit LinkedIn? Post your jobs for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Thank you again for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. The show's free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. Our next question in our weekly mailbag: Jermaine Johnson made a sack against the Steelers and was immediately switched out. Quinnen Williams had made similar plays in the backfield and then also switched out. Is this normal in the NFL? Are these guys actually winded like Ulbrich says? As a fan, it can seem counterproductive to momentum or beating an offensive lineman. He's on the ropes, so maybe he needs help and this frees up others. What are your views on the coaching staff's defensive line rotation? Yeah, it is pretty frequent. It is something that happens pretty frequently when a guy makes a play on the defensive line. He comes out, he gets a rest. It does take up a lot of energy. Now, I know you can say that these are world-class athletes, but you have to remember, they're going full speed, they're giving it their all, they're getting into the backfield, they're making a hit. You probably need a little rest after that, and you see it across the league. Guys come out, and it's true at other positions too. If you ever notice a wide receiver will make a big catch, and then he'll go to the bench to just take a breather. So I don't think it's a big deal. Now, if you look at the Jets right now, I mean, the Jets are paying a lot of money on the defensive line. Jacob Martin's a backup. He's got a decent salary. Jets have invested a lot up front on this defensive line, and they don't really have a lot of top end salaries. I mean, Carl Lawson's around $15 million a year, so it shows you the Jets have kind of been equitable in their distribution of resources on the defensive line. And even a guy like Jermaine Johnson, who's not making much money because he's on his rookie deal, he was a guy they traded back into the first round to get. So if you look at the way this roster was constructed, it was constructed with an eye towards being able to rotate guys in and out on the defensive line. Now, I think it's one of those things, and I've talked about this in past mailbags, I talked about it last week, where it's probably an issue to a certain extent, but it's not as big of an issue as people make it out to be. I mean, you're looking at the top defensive linemen in the league. They're typically only playing about 70 to 80% of the snaps, so they're coming out pretty frequently too. They're missing a number of plays Could the Jets keep guys like Quinn and Williams on the field a little bit more frequently? I think they probably should. I mean, Quinn and Williams is having a great year now. The counter to that is, would Quinn and Williams be playing as well if he did not have as much time to rest? And I think part of it is they want to keep these guys fresh for the fourth quarter of games, because you've seen. I mean, if you watch the NFL for years, you know that sometimes the defense gets exhausted by the end of the game. So you want guys. I think what they're doing, it's hard to keep guys fresh during the games, but it's also so that they don't get worn out near the end of games. Because you see how many times you see the defense get exhausted and defense just starts giving up first down after first down. I think the Jets probably should skew a little bit more towards giving their top guys some snaps, but they're not that far off from the pace of the rest of the league. And while certain guys are not playing as well as you'd hope on the defensive side of the ball, I don't think that there's a disconnect between the coaching staff and the front office. I think the front office very much got them a lot of guys. They're paying a decent amount of money for guys who are rotational guys who are kind of backups, guys who come in periodically. And I think that that's just the way the roster was constructed. I think that sometimes people get these, you hear these things over and over and you use them as explanations for why a unit may not be performing up to expectations. But it's not always fair. And I think that the Jets are a team that they're going to do it more frequently than other teams do, but it's not really the number one explanation for why I know they played well against Pittsburgh. It's people who treat it as though it's the number one explanation for the defensive struggles weeks 1 through 3, and it's really not. It's really not that dissimilar from what other teams are doing. Our next question: do you miss Chuma Edoga yet? He's got to be better than McDermott, right? I don't know that I miss Chuma Edoga. I mean, Chuma Edoga was not very good. I don't think the Jets chose McDermott over Chuma Edoga, though, because if you remember, neither of them made the initial 53-man roster. And I think the Jets were hoping they'd get Edoga back on the practice squad, and surprisingly, he was claimed off waivers. So, I mean, I don't think you can get on the Jets over it. Can you really get on the Jets over cutting Chuma Edoga? Is Chuma Edoga really good enough to get upset over? I don't think so. Would I rather have him than Connor McDermott? Sure, but I think you could be more upset if both of these guys made the initial 53-man roster. That was not the case. Or, I'm sorry, I think you could be more upset if McDermott made the initial 53-man roster over Edoga. Then you could say, well, what were the Jets doing there? Neither of them made it. I think they wanted to bring Edoga back, but Edoga surprisingly got claimed off waivers. So I don't think you can get upset with the Jets over that. Our next question: what is the best way to go about building depth on the offensive line? Are there other teams that have consistently deep offensive lines? This is obviously an issue now for the Jets, but even before the unfortunate rash of injuries to the tackle group, it was a big concern for the team. Yeah, there are pretty much no teams that are built to lose 4 tackles. And the fact the Jets have somebody like VeraTucker playing one of the tackle spots after 4 injuries shows that maybe the depth isn't as bad as we made it out to be. There's really only one way to build depth on the offensive line, and it's through the draft. And it's not just, and I'm not talking about the early picks. You want to find quality backups on the offensive line, you got to hit in the mid to late rounds. And I think that's behind the pick of Max Mitchell. A couple of years ago, the Jets picked a guy, Cameron Clark, in round 4 out of Charlotte. Unfortunately, he had to retire due to injuries. You got to draft guys in the mid rounds, and you got to develop them. The offensive line has become one of those spots where it's become so difficult to find quality that there's almost nobody good who hits free agency. And the guys who do hit free agency end up getting paid way too much money because there are more buyers than there are sellers. There's just it's a supply issue. There just aren't many good offensive linemen who hit free agency. So anybody who's good who does get to free agency, they have multiple bidders and they bid the prices up. But of course, you cannot draft backups. If we're talking about depth, you have to draft starters in the first couple of rounds. So really, if you're looking for good backups, it's really about drafting guys and developing them effectively. Now, ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll close out our weekly mailbag. We'll talk about the role of run-pass options in this offense. It's something Zach Wilson did not do so well his rookie year, but there were signs of improvement in his first game in year 2. That's as we continue this Wednesday mailbag. The Jets play the Miami Dolphins this weekend. Miami is favored, but so were the Steelers last weekend. And if you put money down on the Jets, you probably are pretty happy with how things turned out. Well, if you want to bet this week, betonline.net is your number one source for all of your football betting info this season. You can find all of the latest player developments, team matchups, news, and podcasts, along with in-depth articles and analysis on every game. And as always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all of your sports wagering information, with live betting and up-to-the-minute scores for every sports out there. It's the fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite games and events, so it goes beyond the Jets, it goes beyond the NFL. It includes baseball, MMA, boxing, and golf. Head to betonline.net or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Wednesday mailbag show. Our next question. Zach did a great job with the run-pass option Sunday with the Jets receiving core and the rookie Hall in the backfield. Do you envision this becoming a core of the Jets offense? Well, I think it's a key part of every team's offense. It just works. In a run-pass option, you've probably heard it you've probably heard the term if you've watched games in the NFL the last couple of years. It's exactly what it sounds like. Essentially, you break the huddle, and there's an option for the quarterback to hand the ball off, and there's an option for him to throw the ball. And typically, the quarterback is focused on one defender. As he's handing the ball off, if the defender plays the run, the quarterback pulls it back and just throws the ball past where the defender was. If the defender just sits back and plays the pass, you hand the ball off and you run the ball right at the defender. That's typically how it works. It's a very simple concept that it's amazing it took that long for football offensive minds to come up with because it's so easy. And it puts defenders into conflict because every defender up front, for every play, they have an assignment if the play is a run and an assignment if the play is the pass. So essentially what the run-pass options do is they force the defender to commit to either the run or the pass, and then you do the opposite. So I think it's a core part of every offense, and it's simple. It's simpler than like making your quarterback stand in the pocket and scan the entire field with 5 receivers in their pattern. It's just a simple play, a simple way to move the football. So I think it's a key part of every offense. Now, it's not going to be, unless the NFL changes its rules, it's not going to be as big a part of the playbook as you see in college football. I mean, in college, you can essentially make your entire playbook run-pass options, and that's due to a difference in rules between college football and the NFL. In college football, if you ever heard the penalty ineligible man down the field, essentially an offensive lineman cannot go down the field before the pass is thrown. So in college football, that penalty is only called if an offensive lineman is more than 3 yards down the field during a passing attempt. In the NFL, it can be thrown if an offensive lineman is more than 1 yard down the field. So why does this matter? Well, a lot of long developing passing plays, they take some time to develop. They take some time for the receiver to get to his spot. They take some time for the quarterback to throw the ball. Now, in a run pass option, you'll see a lot of times teams are run blocking for the play. And if you run block effectively, you're going to push the other guy a couple yards down the field. So in college football, when you're run blocking, you can push the defensive lineman 3 yards down the field without being called for a penalty. And that means you can still throw a deep pass because the receivers have plenty of time to get down the field. Quarterback has plenty of time to sit in the pocket. In the NFL, you can only push your defender 1 yard down the field. So if you're run blocking well, it's one of those things where you're doing your job too well. But if you're run blocking well, you can push your guy down the field past 1 yard pretty quickly, and that makes it difficult for these long developing passing plays. So I think the deep passing game, it's tougher to execute run-pass options in the NFL. So it's not going to be as big a part of the playbook as you see in college football. But I think it's going to become more and more a part of playbooks because it's, first of all, simpler for quarterbacks to execute than forcing them to stand in the pocket. But beyond that, it works because you're essentially putting the defense in the position that no matter what they choose, you're wrong. If you play the run, they're going to pass. And if you play the pass, they're going to run the ball. So I think, and this is one other thing I'd like to point out is that Zach Wilson kind of struggled with RPOs his rookie season. So the fact that he was able to look better this year, that was a sign of growth to me. I think that there were 2 areas where Zach showed real progress in this game before the fourth quarter. The first was I felt like he did a good job avoiding sacks, which was kind of an issue a year ago. I mean, last year he was running himself into a lot of sacks. And this year, and the other thing is the RPOs. Last year, I think he kind of struggled, even though they were pretty basic reads. this year, I think he looked a little bit better. Or at least through one game, he looked a little bit better. And our last question, John, what would you consider to be a successful season for Zach? What stats would you expect to see? While his fourth quarter play and pocket presence were good, he still had turnover-worthy passes and misses on short throws. Well, if we're looking for statistical benchmarks, I mean, I think you'd say baseline for like competency is probably around I'd say 62% completion percentage. You want around 7 yards per attempt and probably a 2-to-1 touchdown to interception ratio. If he's doing those things, then I've spoken about finding the balance between being aggressive but not being careless, because you don't want a quarterback who's like constantly checking the ball down like a Flacco, because you may avoid mistakes, but you're not going to move the ball that way. Meanwhile, you don't want a guy constantly throwing into double, triple coverage. So if you're putting out those statistical numbers, then you're in decent shape. I think you'd like to see him, the decision-making improve. I think in that game Sunday, he got away with a couple throws. You would like to see Zach, be a little bit less careless with the ball, because even though like one of the 2 interceptions was not his fault, he probably threw 2 others that he got away with that easily could have been interceptions. So it's about, more than anything, looking competent. I think what we saw Sunday was competency. I want by the end of the year Zach to be kind of like a middle of the pack kind of quarterback. If he does that, I think he's on a pretty good trajectory. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. If you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening. You'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please give the episode a big thumbs up. Both of these help the channel out and help other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great Wednesday, everybody. Well, we will be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.